You step outside on a brutal summer afternoon, and within seconds you're already reaching for something: air conditioning, a cold drink, shade from a car window, some small mechanical relief from the heat pressing down on you. Now imagine that same afternoon with none of that. No AC. No refrigeration. No electric fans. Just you, the sun, and a Roman city built entirely out of heat-absorbing stone and packed with a million other people doing the exact same thing you were, trying to survive the day. So how did Romans actually get through summer without a single piece of cooling technology we consider completely essential today? Let's start with something that might surprise you. Rome, geographically, sits in a genuinely hot Mediterranean climate, and summer temperatures in the city could climb into a range that felt brutal even by ancient standards, made significantly worse by the fact that most of the city was built from stone, brick, and concrete, materials that absorb heat throughout the day and then radiate it back out well into the evening. If you've ever walked through a modern city on a summer night and felt the sidewalk still radiating warmth hours after sunset, you've experienced a small taste of exactly what Roman streets would have felt like, except without a single air conditioner running anywhere nearby to offer relief once you got home. So the first strategy, and honestly the most universal one across the entire ancient Mediterranean world, was simple. You restructured your entire day around the sun. Roman daily life, for those with any flexibility in their schedule, shifted heavily toward the early morning and late afternoon, with the punishing midday hours treated as a natural pause built into the rhythm of the day itself. Business in the forum, market activity, physical labor, anything requiring real exertion, tended to cluster in the cooler hours right after sunrise. Then, as the sun climbed toward its peak and the heat became genuinely dangerous, the city's pace slowed dramatically, sometimes to a near standstill. This wasn't laziness. It was survival logic, the same logic that still shapes daily life across much of the Mediterranean and Middle East today, where extended midday rest periods remain culturally normal precisely because the alternative, pushing through peak heat, carries real physical risk. For wealthier Romans, this midday lull might mean retreating indoors to rest. For laborers, market vendors, and anyone whose income depended on being outside, it often meant finding whatever shade was available and simply waiting the worst of it out, since stopping entirely wasn't always an option when your livelihood depended on selling goods or completing physical work. Now let's talk about water, because this is where Roman engineering genuinely earns its reputation. Rome's famous aqueduct system wasn't just an impressive architectural flex. During brutal summer heat, it was a genuine survival infrastructure, delivering enormous volumes of fresh water into the city daily, feeding public fountains scattered throughout nearly every neighborhood, so that ordinary Romans, not just the wealthy, had reliable access to drinking water within a short walk of home. This mattered enormously, because dehydration in extreme heat isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a genuine medical emergency, and a city without reliable public water access during a Mediterranean summer would have faced a public health crisis far worse than the one Rome actually experienced. Beyond drinking water, there was the bathhouse system, which took on a slightly different role during summer months. While the hot rooms of the thermae remained available year-round, the cold plunge pools, the frigidarium, became genuinely essential during peak summer heat, offering ordinary Romans a place to physically cool their bodies down in a way that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with basic thermal relief. Picture finishing a long, sweaty morning of work and heading straight for a cold plunge, not for relaxation, but because your body genuinely needed it. Clothing tells its own story here too, and it directly challenges a common misconception people carry into this topic. The image many people have of heavy, elaborate Roman clothing, thick togas draped everywhere, doesn't match daily reality for most of the population during summer. The toga itself was formal wear, worn by citizens for specific occasions, not something an ordinary Roman wore while working in the summer heat. Daily clothing for most people was a simple tunic, lightweight, loose-fitting, made from linen or lightweight wool depending on what was available, designed far more for practicality and airflow than for formal appearance. Light colors were common too, since darker fabric absorbs more heat from direct sunlight, a detail Romans understood through simple lived experience even without any formal scientific explanation for why it worked. Home architecture also played a real role, particularly for wealthier Romans living in a domus, a private house rather than a crowded insula apartment block. These homes were frequently built around a central open courtyard, sometimes with a shallow pool or fountain at its center, designed specifically to create airflow and a small pocket of cooler air within the home. Thick stone walls, which absorbed heat slowly throughout the day, could actually help keep interior rooms somewhat cooler during the hottest hours, provided the home had adequate shade and ventilation to prevent that same heat from simply radiating back inward once evening arrived. But here's where the story gets considerably harder, and it's worth being honest about it rather than smoothing it over. Most Romans didn't live in a spacious domus with a private courtyard. Most Romans lived in insulae, cramped multi-story apartment blocks packed tightly together, often several stories tall, built quickly and cheaply, with thin walls, minimal ventilation, and upper floors that trapped heat mercilessly during summer months. If you were poor, your summer heat experience wasn't shaded courtyards and cold plunge pools. It was a stifling, poorly ventilated room, shared with more people than the space was ever designed to comfortably hold, and very little real relief until you could step back outside, which, depending on the hour, might simply trade one form of heat exposure for another. This is really where Roman class division becomes impossible to ignore in this particular topic. Wealthy Romans had genuine architectural and logistical tools for managing extreme heat, private courtyards, household slaves to fetch water and manage household comfort, and often estates outside the city itself where they could simply leave during the worst of summer entirely, a practice historians sometimes compare to a kind of ancient seasonal migration among the elite, retreating to cooler coastal or hillside villas until the harshest heat of the city passed. Ordinary Romans had none of that flexibility. Work still needed doing. Rent still needed paying. And the option to simply relocate somewhere cooler for 2 months simply didn't exist for the vast majority of the population. What about actual medical danger? Ancient physicians, working without any modern understanding of heatstroke as we define it today, were nonetheless aware that extreme heat could seriously harm or kill people, and Roman and Greek medical writing does contain references to illness brought on by excessive heat exposure, sometimes treated with cooling techniques, rest, and hydration that, even without modern medical theory behind them, happen to align reasonably well with what we now know actually helps. This is a case where practical observation, built up over generations of simply watching what worked and what didn't, produced genuinely useful responses even without the underlying science to fully explain why. There's also the question of food during extreme heat, since preserving anything in a Roman summer without refrigeration presented its own serious challenge. Meat and dairy spoiled quickly, which shaped what people actually ate during the hottest months, with lighter meals, more reliance on bread, olives, and preserved foods like salted fish or dried goods that could survive the heat without spoiling as rapidly as fresh perishables would. Markets themselves likely operated earlier in the day during summer specifically to move perishable goods before the worst heat of the afternoon set in, minimizing the window where food sat exposed to dangerous temperatures. There's a specific irony worth pausing on here too. Rome built some of the ancient world's most impressive water infrastructure, aqueducts stretching for miles, elaborate fountain networks, enormous public bathhouses, and yet none of that engineering brilliance solved the more basic architectural problem of insulae apartment blocks trapping heat mercilessly for the majority of the city's population. Impressive engineering existed side by side with genuinely miserable summer living conditions for ordinary Romans, a contradiction that tells you something important about how Roman infrastructure investment tended to prioritize visible public works over less glamorous improvements to ordinary housing. So step back and look at the complete picture. Surviving Roman summer heat meant restructuring your entire daily rhythm around the sun's position, relying on genuinely impressive public water infrastructure that benefited rich and poor alike, wearing simple lightweight clothing suited to the climate rather than the formal togas often associated with Rome in popular imagination, and, if you had the wealth and status to do so, potentially escaping the city entirely for cooler ground until the worst of it passed. For everyone else, summer simply had to be endured, using whatever shade, water, and rest you could manage to find within a city that offered impressive engineering in some areas and almost none in others. It's also worth looking at some of the smaller, less obvious tricks Romans used to manage heat within their homes and streets, details that rarely make it into broader summaries of Roman engineering. Wealthier homes sometimes used simple shading devices, awnings made of cloth stretched across courtyards or narrow streets, reducing direct sun exposure during the hottest part of the day. Public spaces like the Forum occasionally used similar canopy structures during major events, a practical adaptation that shows Romans were actively thinking about sun exposure as a real design problem, not simply accepting it as unavoidable. Narrow streets in denser parts of the city, while cramped and often unpleasant for other reasons, did have one accidental benefit, creating shade for much of the day as tall insulae blocked direct sunlight from reaching street level, a side effect of dense urban planning rather than an intentional cooling strategy, but a genuine benefit nonetheless. Plants and greenery played a role too, particularly in wealthier households. Garden courtyards weren't purely decorative. Trees and climbing vines provided real shade, and the moisture from watered gardens could create a small, noticeable cooling effect in the immediate surrounding air, a basic principle of evaporative cooling that Romans understood through simple observation, long before anyone had a scientific term for what was actually happening. For ordinary Romans without access to a private garden, public parks and green spaces, where they existed, would have offered some of that same relief, a shared resource in a city where private cooling options were reserved almost entirely for those who could afford land and water access. So the next time you complain about summer heat while standing in front of an open refrigerator or reaching for a thermostat, remember that for a Roman, surviving the exact same season meant rebuilding your entire day around the sun, relying on public fountains fed by aqueducts built centuries earlier, and, if you were unlucky enough to live in a cramped upper-floor apartment, simply enduring heat with nothing more than open windows, thin clothing, and whatever water you could carry home.